Hello and welcome to Generation 16, the series that showcases the history of Sega's Mega Drive. I'm your host, Greg Seward. December 1990 has been the biggest month in the history of the Mega Drive thus far, featuring more than 20 games released, and over half of them shooters. Heavy Unit isn't necessarily the final game in this group chronologically, as Gyarados was released on the same day, but nonetheless, we've reached the end of the road for the genre in this jam-packed month, and I'm afraid we're closing on a bit of a whimper. Heavy Unit started life as an arcade game coded by Kaneko in 1988, back when the company was mostly a contract developer for Toho. It is a fairly straightforward horizontal two-player shooter where the hook is that your fighter can transform into a humanoid mech via power-ups that can be collected throughout each level, not unlike Sega's Arrow Flash, which had been released on the Mega Drive just days earlier. Transforming into a mech alters your fighter's weapons a bit, but also makes you a bigger, slower target for your enemies to hit. As we previously discussed in the DJ Boy episode, Kaneko had an in-house development group called Interstate, which would port its arcade games to home consoles. And port Heavy Unit they did, but not to the Mega Drive. The Interstate version was released on the PC Engine, which isn't too surprising, I guess, considering the popularity of NEC's console in Japan in 1990. However, the game's publisher, Toho, was one of the most active Japanese publishers on the Mega Drive at the time. So it's a bit odd then that Heavy Unit Mega Drive Special is the Mega Drive debut of Toho, a name that most folks probably associate more with Godzilla and Seven Samurai than scrolling arcade shooters on 16-bit consoles. But the cinema giant had been publishing video games since the early 80s on platforms like the MSX and Famicom, and not all of them were simply Godzilla titles. Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Circus Caper being two of its most recent releases. Heavy Unit would be Toho's one and only foray onto the Mega Drive, however, as it chose to focus mostly on the Super Famicom in the ensuing years. Porting duties for Heavy Unit were handled by a developer called Funari. There's not a lot of information out there on this team. Like with Toho, Heavy Unit would mark Funari's one and only appearance on the Mega Drive. According to the Game Developer Research Institute, Funari's only credits are this port and a Game Boy game called Pokanyan Yume no Daiboken, also published by Toho. The team may have been founded by previous members of Data East's Sapporo office. Unlike in the aforementioned Arrow Flash, you are not in control of your fighter's transformation in Heavy Unit. It's actually triggered by a collectible T icon. While in fighter form, you're faster and harder to hit, but are pretty weak, even with powered-up weapons. In mech form, you're a gigantic target and move a bit sluggishly, but your weapons are quite strong, including homing missiles handy for the frequent situations where you get surrounded. Let's talk about the options screen for a minute. Unlike a lot of games at the time, which would require you to input some arcane button combo to access a screen which would, say, grant you extra lives or unlock later levels, Heavy Unit on the Mega Drive allows you to input simple codes right in the options menu to do everything from gaining 99 credits, to showing stage scroll data, to completely swapping the game's color palette. It's hard to say how readily available these codes were back in 1990, but I'm sure they didn't take too long to make the rounds, and either way, it's a pretty unique feature for the time. The options screen features other standard fare like control mapping, lives, difficulty, etc. The other bit worth noting here is the control style, both normal and organized mode. On the normal setting, Heavy Unit plays exactly like you would expect a shooter on the Mega Drive to feel. But when control is set to organized mode, the ship actually has a bit of weight to it, taking a split second to gain and lose momentum as you send it in different directions. It's not a huge change, but you definitely notice the difference when you play. The movement doesn't feel quite so digital, more akin to something played with an analog controller. As was pretty normal for shooters in 1990, Heavy Unit lost its multiplayer feature on the trip to the Mega Drive. But while there are a few other minor changes, this is a pretty faithful port. The aforementioned options mean you can dial it in for almost any difficulty level, which is definitely a blessing for less skilled players on the heels of games like Musha and Gyara's. The action here is simple and straightforward. Just fly to the right and shoot anything that moves. And while most of the visuals don't blow you away, there are some very cool looking enemies who appear from time to time. Some flaming dragon heads in the first level actually require you to stop and think about how to get past, rather than just shooting your way forward. Explosive barriers, giant faces that spew smaller enemies, and some pretty large level bosses keep the game at least looking fresh throughout. Poor Heavy Unit. Mega Drive games were improving by leaps and bounds at the end of 1990, and shooters in particular. It's not an age thing though. Heavy Unit was only 2 years old when it hit the system. I think it has more to do with the fact that this was, as far as I know, Kaneko's first attempt at creating something in the genre. It's a solid first try, but it had the misfortune of coming home at exactly the same time as other games on the system were evolving. Star Cruiser's fully 3D visuals, Wonder Boy 3's platforming elements, and Gyara's innovative TOS system are just a few recent examples, and all of those games hit the system less than a week before Heavy Unit. Perhaps, had this come out sometime in the first half of 1990, it would be more well remembered. As it is, it's not hard to see why Heavy Unit never made the trip across the pond. Kaneko's next Mega Drive shooter would be much more fondly remembered. And that'll do it for this episode of Generation 16. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw, please like, share, and subscribe. And please consider supporting the show on Patreon. Join me next time as Sega brings the arcade home one last time in 1990. See you then.